Well, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me again for this week's series of daily devotionals. By the way, I am wearing a t-shirt. I'll stand up so you can see it. It's a new t-shirt. What it is, it's Hebrew, the Hebrew word for ahava, which means love. So nothing too profound, but kind of a Hebrew hippie version and a kind of a stylized script, which is very cleverly put together. So anyway, so therefore you don't have to ask me. Okay, today we're actually going to begin or continue looking at Titus. We're starting in chapter 2. We finally made it through chapter 1. And chapter 2 gets really very specific in terms of who we find that Paul is addressing. And he kind of breaks down the community into 5 different major groupings. Basically, he speaks about older men, he talks about older women, he talks about younger women, younger men, and then he talks about slave. And that basically was the demographic divisions of the society. It wasn't necessarily the social or political divisions. We know people had very different levels of status, but when you talk about generally the community, it's made up of these 5 groupings. Now, the only thing that's somewhat unfair about all of this is that they don't all share the same status in the community. Older men were the elders, and generally the elders were those who, in a patriarchal culture, ruled over the culture. Older women, though, had tremendous influence, and then there were younger women who were expected to be married under almost every circumstance and to bear children, and younger men were expected to get married and behave in a certain way. And then last of all, slaves were people who literally they were property. They were not considered to be different individuals, except within the context of the church. And it's interesting, historically, we find that slaves were really attracted to Christianity in the early Roman world because they were able to be treated with equality and respect, which was something that was quite revolutionary and something that basically the overall culture found very challenging. So it's interesting because in the church, there was somewhat of an equality, not only to slaves, but also to younger women. And as a result, there was a real draw, obviously, to the gospel of Christ, and really ran counter to the culture. And this is one of those dynamics that's kind of interesting when you talk about the life of the church in the world as it's lived out, that Christianity began as clearly a countercultural movement. And by that, I mean that what was being taught was contrary to the mores or the value system of the culture. And the Roman world and the Greek world before it, and probably was true of the Persian world, they respected power and authority. Might made things right. And there are often a set of rules, laws of the land, if you will, which would have been completely counter to those of the Bible. So whereas in the Bible we find that all men are created equal in the eyes of God, and of course that was put into our own Constitution and Bill of Rights, the reality is that the world around them at this time where the Christianity was growing did not support that value. It did not see an equality of people. It saw people having different levels of value and different levels of ascendancy. So even in Judaism at the time, if a person had a physical illness, if they were blind, if they were disabled in any other way, it was viewed as being the judgment of God, and they were treated as lesser beings. They might be allowed to be part of the community and survive, but they will never be in a position of influence or importance because they had that error in their being, and therefore they were viewed as less important, less valuable. In other words, if you can't contribute, you don't really have a significant role. And of course, it's left up to people to decide how you define contributing. It's kind of like the idea of people wanting to abort children who have Down syndrome when they do the amniocentesis of the child in the womb. You know, they tell whether or not it's going to become a Down's child, and as a result, they encourage the parents to abort the child. And it's really kind of tragic because people who suffer with Down syndrome are oftentimes some of the most loving, kind, and blessed people, happiest people. And I think it's like anything else in life that how people contribute to the welfare of other people is a matter of perception. But all the families I've known, and even the people I've known in my congregation who have suffered from mental disabilities, they're really, really darling, wonderful, gracious people, very loving and very accepting. And I really, really like them. And I think they're a great contribution. And so you realize that even in our modern Western culture, we can have some pretty primitive views of things where we look at certain people and say they're no longer valuable. And that's kind of where we're going anyway. The idea of euthanasia that's really began to spread in Europe and particularly in Canada, the idea that you're not, as the Nazis used to say, it's not a life worth living. And so as a result, they're saying you should terminate your life for the welfare of everybody else. And it's really not a biblical idea. That's a very primitive idea. It's not the idea of me sacrificing for others, but me asking you to sacrifice for my welfare. It's just the opposite of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So anyway, what Paul says when we get into here in verse 1 of chapter 2 with a really kind of overarching statement to Titus, and it's really a repeating of something he said at the end of chapter 1. He said, you must teach what is in accord with sound doctrine. Now it's interesting. The word sound here is actually in the Greek, it's the root word for our word hygiene. And that's the idea to be healthy, to be in good health and good condition. In other words, what Paul was saying to Titus is that good doctrine, true doctrine, doctrine that is consistent with God's revelation in his word, is doctrine that works well like a medicine in your soul and will translate in your body. Those of you who have spent time reading the scriptures and are familiar with what it teaches, you realize that there are so many basic life lessons, so many basic life disciplines that it says if you observe these things, it will go well with you. For example, even the commandment that says, honor your mother and your father, that it might go well with you, that you might prosper, and you might live a long life. Well, Paul said that's the first commandment that had a promise attached to it. And that's so important for us to understand, is because essentially it says for people to really live a well-balanced life, psychologically, physically, mentally, and otherwise, there needs to be this harmonious relationship within the family unit. And we find more and more those family units are being split apart. It's hard to find a family that I talk to anymore that doesn't have their sons or daughters or people within their immediate realm who are at odds with them over various things. And it really has its root in the fact that there's no longer respect for the position of parents or the authority that they should hold. And so you'll find these people feel quite at liberty to say all sorts of disparaging things to whoever will listen to them about their parents or their family members. And the reality is that that is inviting hardship on your life. That won't lead you to a healthy state mentally and emotionally, and it will probably express itself therefore into other areas of your life. It's kind of a downward flow into areas of your life you think would never be touched to it. It affects your career. It affects all your future relationships. That's why one of the things I was taught before I ever got married was that you need to look at the relationship of your spouse, your future spouse. How do they relate to their parents? What kind of relationship do they have? And where there's conflicts between their relationship, there's going to be conflicts in yours. Particularly as a guy, it was really important to me that my wife really loved her dad and was very close to him, because I thought then she's really feels good about being around men who love her. And so as a consequence, that's worked out really well for us. But you find when there's really animosity or strife or stress, you'll find that that will carry over into the marriage, that a woman who has conflicts and stresses with her own father, until she reconciles that in her own heart, usually through her relationship with Christ, she's going to find herself unaware relating to her husband in exactly the same way she conflicted with her father. And the same is true between men and their mothers and the way they react to their wives. So these are really critical dynamics that sometimes we don't give a lot of thought or attention to, but they are central to the well-being of our life. And so it's really important that we understand that bringing our life into agreement with God's word has greater implications than just the immediate moment of being obedient and not being in sin, but rather it begins to filter its way through every relationship and every dynamic of our life, that the closer we walk with God, the healthier everything in our life will become. Well, just about out of time, but we'll pick this up tomorrow because I think these are some really critically important issues. Blessings.